Hey parents, thanks so much for checking out the Family Room. I'm continuing to experiment with video as we do these When Can I Watch columns. Last week we talked about Ender's Game, and this week we have one of the biggest films on the calendar for parents, especially parents who have young kids who are into comic books. And of course I'm talking about Thor: The Dark World, which is the 8th Marvel film. If we're talking about just films that are being made under the Marvel Studios banner, films that include the Avengers, obviously, the origin stories for Captain America and for Iron Man, for the Incredible Hulk, and then for Thor. And this is the second standalone film for Thor with Chris Hemsworth in the role. We're going to start with the green lights of the franchise, which anytime we talk about these Marvel movies, it's simply going to be the thrill of being able to take your comic book fan to a movie with legitimate Marvel characters on the screen. I think it's still something very unprecedented that we're dealing with here in terms of seeing these superheroes come to life on the big screen. And even though we've now seen Hemsworth as Thor in the origin film directed by Kenneth Branagh and then on screen in the Avengers, there's still something really exciting about being able to travel to a physical realm of Asgard, and in this case to visit the 9 realms where Thor has to travel to restore peace before he's able to ascend to the throne. You know, there are a lot of interesting green lights, especially if your kids are growing up now on these Marvel films. The studio understands that these are recognizable brands and that they can make a Captain America joke, you know, or an Avengers reference, and our kids are savvy enough to pick up on them. You know, in terms of violence and combat, it's a little bit Game of Thronesy, and it's just very similar to things that we've seen in the Marvel movies. So if your kids are accustomed to that level of fighting, of choreographed violence, I think that there isn't anything more extreme than that. Let's transition over into the red flag section of the Thor: The Dark World When Can I Watch column review, and there aren't a ton of them, to be honest with you, especially since this is the 8th Marvel film that your kids have probably absorbed up until this point if you've allowed them to see all of the ones leading up to this. And if they've seen the Avengers or if they've seen the first Thor, then they kind of know what to expect out of these films. And I think Marvel knows that it's catering to a younger audience and doesn't necessarily want to alienate families that want to bring their young kids to these adventures, because, I mean, most of the action that takes place is supposed to stimulate younger audiences, you know, of course, and older geeks like myself who want to see these Marvel characters come to life on screen. But really, they're aimed at 10 and 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds, people who are reading comic books now and who really want to see the next stages of these Thor and Captain America and Avenger films. There's a little bit of language to worry about, nothing major. There's a well-placed S-bomb by Kat Dennings. A couple of go to hells and things like that, and the funny thing is that normally my son would hear him and he'd quickly look over at me and be like, did you hear that too? Did I just hear what he just said? Now, he's getting older, I guess. It didn't faze him necessarily, and you should just know that there's a little bit of language, but of course the Marvel sort of understands what's happening. So if there's anything that sort of set me off about Thor: The Dark World is that the plot might be a little too confusing for kids, and it rushes through a lot of its explanations, falling back on astrophysicist explanations from Jane Foster's character. So just be prepared to chalk it up to comic book logic when your kids ask you questions about what's happening in Thor: The Dark World and why. But outside of that, I'd say that the film is appropriate for kids who've been brought up on Marvel films up to this point, and I'll elaborate a little bit more in the appropriate age section below.